wherever you might be in the world. And thank you for joining us on the inaugural Gen.T stream. My name is Tamara Lamounière, and I am the head of Gen.T. It's exciting for us to see that there are close to 200 of you who have joined us today from all over the world, primarily from around Asia. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope that you enjoy today's session. It's been a challenging time for everyone of late. On both the personal and the professional fronts, we've all had to face an enormous amount of upheaval and challenges. And it's for this reason that we decided to try and give you some tools to help you navigate these challenges. The theme of today's stream, which is Gen.T's virtual conference, is Reimagining Our Shared Future, taking control of the next chapter. As a media and community platform, Gen.T is committed to supporting Asia's most promising entrepreneurs in an effort to give them the tools to be able to accelerate and grow, as well as to accelerate their impact on society. But that society and the future that we're all living in is changing right before our eyes. So it's our hope that with this session today, you're able to walk away inspired and empowered with the ideas and the opportunities that still lie ahead of us in the new world. We have an exciting agenda planned for you today. We're going to be starting with a keynote presentation from Dr. Parag Khanna. Parag joins us from Singapore. The best-selling author, academic, and futurist will be talking to us about why the future is still Asian and what are the opportunities for entrepreneurs in a post-COVID world. He'll also help us to ask some interesting human and moral questions that we need to be asking ourselves right now. Then we'll move on to a fireside chat with Matt Breimer. Matt joins us from New York. Matt is probably best known as being the co-founder of educational platform General Assembly, as well as the Conscious Morning Festival Daybreaker. Matt is also a serial investor and entrepreneur, and he'll be helping us to explore the topic of how we can continue to create real impact in a socially distant world. Then we'll be moving on to a surprising intermission with pop star Sheila Amza. The spectacular Miss Sheila Amza joins us from Malaysia. The award-winning singer, songwriter, producer, and new mother will be entertaining us with some songs both in English and in Mandarin. Then we'll move on to the last part of today's session, which will be a fireside chat with Miss Maria Ressa. The formidable Maria Ressa is probably one of Asia's best-known journalists, aside from being the CEO and co-founder of the Philippine news media website, Rappler. Maria will be helping us to explore the topic of how we can overcome adversity and what are the values and the trends that will see us through challenging times. Then we're going to end today's session with some virtual networking, where we'll be utilizing Zoom's breakout rooms, so do stick around for that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite your host for today, the editor of Gen.T, Lee Williamson, to join me here today. Lee?
Thank you, Tamara. Good morning, Gen.T honorees, leaders across Asia and indeed around the world. I hope you're keeping safe and sane, whether you're under lockdown or like us here in Hong Kong, lucky enough to be back in the office and hopefully seeing a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. But exactly when this pandemic will end, nobody knows. But one thing that we do know is that there's no going back to normal when it does. This question, how we can reimagine our future, is where we will be laser focused for the next 2 hours. Starting with our first speaker, Dr. Parag Khanna. Parag is an international relations expert, the founder of strategic advisory firm Future Map, and also the best-selling author of 6 books. Most recently, the aptly titled, The Future is Asian. Parag will start the morning with a keynote that will lay out the roadmap to the next normal. I should note that Parag's slides are incredibly detailed, but don't worry too much about scribbling down every single detail and fact that you see in there. We will share the entire deck with everybody in this webinar straight after the call. Parag will speak for about 20 minutes, and then I will come back to lead a 10-minute Q&A session. I'll be asking some of the questions that you submitted during the registration process, as well as some of the questions that come up in the chat box while he's talking as well. So simply click on the chat icon to connect with everybody that's here this morning, as well as to submit your questions to Parag and all of our speakers this morning. Finally, we will also send out a quick poll during each talk. Do let us know your thoughts, and we will incorporate your perspective into the Q&A section as well. So without much further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Parag Khanna. Parag, are you there?
Fear not, I am here.
Hey,
Just
Parag,
give a
good
second to
morning.
unmute. Good morning, Tamara. Good morning, Lee. Thanks so much for including me in this program, and I really want to applaud you for putting this together. I know how difficult it is to do this, and you've had everything in place for an amazing physical in-person event, and so you've been very resilient and adaptable. I want to thank everyone who's joined as well from all over the world. I'm really honored again to be part of this, and certainly to be joining two other people who I greatly admire, Matt and Maria. So looking forward to this program. So should I jump right in and start sharing the slides?
Absolutely. The ship is yours for the next 20 minutes, Parag. We're really looking forward to seeing the insights you have to share, and I'll be back in 10 minutes to lead in 20 minutes to lead the Q&A session. Over to you, Parag.
Sure. Are you seeing the slide, post-pandemic world?
We can see it just fine, yeah.
Great. Now, let me start with a caveat. This is actually still the with pandemic world, let's face it. We don't really know when this is going to end. This is the seminal event of our times, and events like this, whether it's a world war or a financial crisis or a plague, don't exactly go away overnight. This is going to really be an event that imprints this entire generation really for the rest of our lives in various ways, shapes, and forms. I'm not going to dwell necessarily on the next 100 years today, but let me at least kick off how we should think about maybe the next 4 or 5 years. Let me begin by pointing out that before this pandemic, we were already moving towards a tri-polar world, a world that was really shifting and moving to 3 different speeds: a North American speed, a European speed, and an Asian speed. You could actually say that this is what's been happening since the last major crisis, which was the financial crisis more than a decade ago, where North America recovered more quickly than Europe. You started to see more stimulation of internal trade. You had the election of Trump and the trade war, which meant that suddenly by last year, the United States was trading more with Canada and with Mexico than with China even, right? So this decoupling that people have been talking about has actually been happening anyway. Now, let's imagine the world's longest border on Earth is between the United States and Canada. We have no idea when that's going to reopen, right? So regionalism is going to be the new normal. To the extent that people start to travel again and move again, it's going to be intra-regionally. That's certainly true of Europe. Now, Europe, again, 70% of its trade is internal. They're working on a fiscal arrangement to try and bail out Southern European countries and keep the Eurozone together. We'll see if they succeed at that. Again, we're all accustomed to the Schengen Agreement.
Parag, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We are getting some comments in the chat box that some people can't see your slides. We can over here, but we believe that some attendees can't. Would you mind please stopping sharing your screen and then starting again? The old turn it off, turn it back on again trick, and we'll see if that works.
Sure. Okay, I have stopped share, and I will start share again.
Okay.
Desktop, here we go, share, and present mode. And we should be on that same slide again. You see it?
Yes, we can all see it now. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Great. No problem. Again, as you said, you're more than welcome to distribute them later on as well. So, the Schengen Agreement that we've all gotten used to, borderless mobility within Europe, shut down, right? Only Europe can determine when that's going to reopen again. So let me focus on Asia, because what's been happening, again, over the last 10 years, Asians have learned that when there is a global crisis, they actually need to integrate further. They need to become more self-reliant. When there's a global economic demand shock, such as what has just happened, they have to trade more with each other, bring down more barriers. Now, in terms of mobility, obviously that's going to be incremental. But again, this is the region of the world where already you see Australia and New Zealand agreeing that they'll have a travel bubble. And given what we've done here in Asia with contact tracing apps and internationalizing that, I can imagine that immunity passports and this kind of thing between pairs of Asian countries, you already see Chinese travelers coming down to Vietnam and to Thailand again. So I think that Asia is actually going to open up faster than other regions of the world. Also, you have the trade agreements and the trade liberalization. In other parts of the world, we hear about protectionism, walls, and borders, and you hear about nationalism and populism here in Asia too, obviously. But on the policy level, there's actually been a fair bit of pragmatism in terms of internal integration within ASEAN, between ASEAN and Northeast Asian countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. So I see a fair bit of pragmatism in Asia. And this is, as you see in the bubbles in the background, Asia is 50% of the world economy. It is more than 50% of the world population. So I think that, as you mentioned at the beginning, is the future still Asian? I mean, the present is most definitely Asian. The future is most definitely going to be even more Asian. It's the rest of the world that depends on Asia more than Asia depends on the rest of the world. That's not an opinion, that's an economic fact. So it's up to us here in this region to decide what we're going to do with it. The lesson that was learned after the 98 financial crisis and the 2008 crisis was that Asia can do a lot more to leverage the complementarities across our large populations and societies. And one of the things that I'm doing right now, obviously, is advocating squeezing out more of those benefits in the relations. Very quick point here, just to point out how different Asia is than this broader category of emerging markets. Asia is not emerging. Asia has emerged. Asia has arrived. Asian stocks are performing better than other developing or so-called emerging market regions. The only reason that the emerging market category is performing or rebounding at all, to the extent it is because it includes some Asian equities in it. So really, Asia is a zone unto itself now. Again, I'll just make one or 2 points here. What often happens in a crisis when you have the widening deficits in countries, the need to spend more, bailout, stimulus, and so forth, is a recognition that they need to reform economies to draw in more capital. So those market reforms are now underway. Part of that, B, is privatization. Every country in this region has announced over the last 4 or 5 years major plans to privatize companies. Think about India, Vietnam, and others. And now, if they've been laggard or slow in those making good on those promises, they're going to do it now because they want to draw in that foreign investment. So that's actually an opportunity in many ways for Asia to move ahead. I talk to a lot of private equity funds and so forth, and here in the region, they're saying, we're sitting on all of this dry powder, right? 2021 is going to be a great year for them. Prices have come down. Assets, in any case, in the equity markets were relatively cheaper in Asia than in other parts of the world. So you're going to see actually a tremendous influx of investment, private capital, whether it's from within the region or internationally into Asia in the years ahead. Capital account liberalization is another part of that, with money going to Chinese equities and bonds, and the same thing happening in other developing countries. So it's another reason to be optimistic in the medium to long term about the region. Let's talk about technology. Now, this is a double-edged sword, as we know. On the one hand, the same sectors that have been hit the hardest in labor markets globally, North America, Europe, and Asia, those areas that are heavily labor intensive, retail, logistics, travel for sure, and so forth. These are areas that are going to have not only been hit by the pandemic because of the standstill, but also because of AI. Right, and labor automation is going to accelerate. More jobs will be lost. However, there's a huge advantage or opportunity still to deploy technology, to create jobs in deploying technology, because even though wherever you may be right now, you're probably in a place with fast fiber internet and 5G broadband and so forth. There's still a long way to go in deploying those technologies around Asia, given the huge population. So I still think that it's not going to be an either or between technology and jobs. It is in some categories, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to move people up the value chain, train them, and so forth. So I'd like to see us focus on the kind of positive side of technological transformation as a job creator and productivity booster here in Asia. Giving you some examples here around how the digital sector is obviously, if you will, catapulting. As a result, we know that a lot of asset classes have come down, commercial real estate and aviation and so forth are struggling. But look at logistics, look at e-commerce, look at, of course, again, telecommunications, data storage and warehousing, remote working apps, OTT kinds of things, mobile finance. All of these high value added companies are going to surge on the back of this pandemic as we move more towards remote work and sort of digital services more and more. So I'm trying to sort of focus on connectivity as what I call the most important asset class of the 21st century. You may be, again, I'll just emphasize this again, you may take it for granted, but we're talking about the 5 billion people of Asia, the 8 billion plus people of the world. There's still a long way to go. And the more inclusively we think about these things, the more we see the opportunity. Some IPOs that we're expecting this year. But, obviously the timelines may shift for some of these, but this is just a small sampling of what we're expecting in terms of the pipeline of IPOs ahead, just in the Asian region, particularly China, Singapore, India. And again, this is just illustrating the previous point that these are all companies that are digital, that are software, that are digitizing industries. It could be, the next wave will also include more companies that are doing 3D printing, medical devices, and so forth, because the pandemic is teaching us, that we have to appreciate those sectors more and invest more in them. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Migration. This is really important. Again, what's happened in the wake of the pandemic is that April 2020 really in particular will probably forever be remembered as the month the world stood still. And yet, historically, if you look at either the Black Death of the 14th century or the Spanish flu and other major pandemics and more broadly national disasters, what you find is that people tend to move after these events. And as you can imagine, many people in the world, billions of people around the world, who are in red zones, places that don't have adequate health care, that are that feel like they have been ill-served by their governments, they will want to pick up and move to green zones, places that have better public services, healthcare, and so forth. So why do people move? It's a very big question. I'm writing my entire next book about it, so I don't want to get carried away, but I'm just listing the top 6 reasons over the last 75 years that have motivated migration. All 6 of them are accelerating. All 6, no exceptions. And not only that, as you know, in the real world, these things can't be neatly separated from each other. They're all intersecting and reinforcing each other. So I expect a huge new set of waves of human migration in the years ahead as people search for this combination of what I call the right latitude, altitude, and attitude, right? So latitude, you can imagine, look at the map on the right, what happens to global agriculture and livability of climates as temperatures rise. Altitude, so maybe distance from sea level as well, given what's happening with climate change, and attitude, right? Good policy. This map on the right, by the way, is not meant to scare you and start, encourage you to buy property in Siberia, but it's meant to just show the kinds of changes that our climate is experiencing more broadly. So people are looking for food security, sustainability, circular economy, healthcare, all of those kinds of things, affordability, and this resorting of the global population is probably going to take off, and this is a mega trend to watch in the years ahead. So what are people looking for? As I mentioned before, these kind of characteristics of places in terms of quality of life. So I went and started looking at all of these indices and rankings, whether it is World Bank ease of doing business, or quality of government, quality of infrastructure, wealth, innovation, INSEAD surveys, McKinsey rankings of countries for their degree of connectedness, and so on and so forth. And I found that, by and large, it is smaller European countries that rank highest across the board. Singapore and Hong Kong are the top performers in Asia. Again, relatively small, city-state-like entities. And the 2 top-ranking countries in the world across a wide range of these indicators are Switzerland and Singapore. Again, small countries tend to do best because their margin for error is smaller. They cannot afford, in a way, to be as corrupt. There's a lot of transparency locally into what government is doing. They tend to focus on resilience and stockpiling of resources and so forth. In general, what they try to do is have this balance of the 2 things that I think we all innately seek. One is security, so security of our immediate physical environment. That could also mean not just military security, but biosecurity as well, food security, and connectivity, because that is also a fundamental human impulse, right? To be connected to other geographies, to other people, to have a certain degree of density and so forth. I think that this is programmed within us to seek security and connectivity at the same time and to balance those forces. And I think people are going to be looking to move to or settle or have, a sort of a rabbit hole, if you will, in these kinds of geographies. So let me get back to the sectors that are going to benefit and perhaps some of the places where they are. So again, without going into all the detail, we know that there is a new Manhattan project really underway in terms of biotechnology. And I think one should look obviously very strongly at the not only biotech companies and but also pharmaceutical companies, not least here in Asia, that have reminded the world actually what a lion's share of the world's market they already control. So there's going to be a lot of growth in that area. I mentioned earlier 3D printing of medical devices, which is both a source of, if you will, kind of domestic resilience to have 3D printing of materials, but also obviously a source of innovation. And a large driver of sort of product manufacturing for export as well. So I think there's going to be a healthy competition there. Let me emphasize also agriculture. We actually have enough food in the world to feed 8, 9, 10 billion people. But what have we witnessed with this crisis? We've witnessed that because of border closures, export embargoes, we've had countries like Russia banning the export of wheat, Vietnam with rice, and so forth. So what is going to be the lesson learned out of that? It's going to be to invest more in agricultural output. That applies very much here in Asia. We have some of the rice bowls, and agricultural hubs of the world here, but they're not sufficiently productive. We don't have enough mechanization of agriculture. We are not using enough data analytics for forecasting meteorological patterns and crop rotation. More is being done by a lot of companies in genetically modified organisms and foods, and so on and so forth. So a lot of investment can go into this area, and that's going to be very important for our future collective resilience. Then there is food storage technologies, food tracking and tracing technologies. Think about countries like China, where there's an enormous premium paid for certifiable or tracked, traced food to ensure that whether it's beef from Australia or other crops and goods from New Zealand and so forth. So a lot of opportunity there. Let me mention hydroponics and aquaponics, and I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with this already, but here in Japan, Australia, and other countries have been leaders in developing these technologies that can really sort of pump out a substantial amount of staple crops, lettuce and this kind of stuff. And now that can also be done in urban environments as well. So a tremendous amount of investment will go into this area, even more so than has been done already. Give the example here of Singapore. They have announced something called 30 by 30 initiative, which is to have 30% of the staple consumption of poultry, fish through fish farming that's local or just sort of offshore, as well as using these kinds of facilities, hydro and aquaponic, for generating basic vegetables and so forth. Now, in the wake of this pandemic, or in the midst of it rather, the Singapore government has started to bring back that timeline. They say, why should we aim for 30 by 2030? It looks more like we need to do this by 2023, right? So that's one example. The United Arab Emirates has made a similar announcement. So countries that are smart, that have the capital, that are doing the future planning, are saying, let's accelerate this process of localized, technologically driven food production. So another interesting area. Environmental technology. We can't forget climate change in all of this, and we already have actually in Asia and also, but importantly globally, a lot of innovation in everything from water desalination to obviously solar power, where Asia has become a leader, battery technologies, even hydrogen power. And I think that whether, especially if you're involved in the venture capital field or private equity or public equity as well, the investments that need to go into this area to distribute these technologies to all of the places that in particular face water shortages, that are large fuel importers. Even with oil prices being down, we want to be stimulating the sort of industrial transformation and the energy transformation for countries around the region. Now, this is my final point. I've just given you kind of like a bazooka or water cannon of kind of data and points around specific industries, but I also want to take a big step back here as we wrap up this part of the conversation. And I've been kind of thinking about what is the lesson that this generation, our generation, your generation, needs to take away from watching some countries succeed, other countries fail. Us as a collective species, how are we handling this universal crisis. And I want to go back to one point first, which is that, again, April 2020, the lockdown, the global lockdown, humankind has never coordinated a single act in this way. And it wasn't because the United Nations said so. It wasn't because Washington said so, or London, or Paris, or Beijing, right? It was done through the internet. It was done, actually, there's data now coming out of the US that shows that it was consumers who exercised caution and kind of pulled back from going out and doing retail consumption even before many states announced their lockdown. It was citizens, it was scientists, it was social media that helped the world coordinate and to push for this global lockdown. So we as a species, as 8 billion-ish people, can actually do something, can do things together in a way that we have never done before. I think that is staggeringly powerful, a realization. So what are we going to do going forward? And this is not going to be universal. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do in our context, in our community, constituency, country, to push for positive changes, more ethical kinds of governance? And I give you a lot of examples here. Let me just explain. You know, pandemic bonds. I don't know if you've heard of this, and I won't go into too much detail, but pandemic bonds were bonds raised that would be payouts to countries in the event of a disaster, rather than simply raising capital before the disaster to help countries prepare for that disaster. Now, this is like the securitization of human life, and it's not something that we should naturally think is a good idea. And yet that's exactly what we were doing. How about the difference between essential and non-essential services? How many people stop to think about whether or not we are valuing in the marketplace, in the labor market? Are we paying the right salaries and wages for people who work in truly essential services rather than non-essential services? And of course, I want to give credit here to Asian countries where actually essential services tend to be valued and salaries are high in these areas, or decent living wages, whereas in a lot of countries they're not. And now the world economy is going to be divided into essential and non-essential services. So what are you investing in? Is your society valuing those things? And if it's not, what can you do to do it better, and so forth? What are we doing with our stranded assets? We now have empty shopping malls, we have empty sports stadiums, empty hotels, and we're going to have them for a long time. What are we doing for the homeless? What are we doing for students? What are we doing for all of the people who can't access, you know, basic public services like healthcare? Which countries are going to transform their physical infrastructure and assets to be more utilitarian, to be more inclusive? And the answers to these questions will play themselves out. They may seem obvious, I'm asking them rhetorically, and yet in the real world, we know that we're going to go in 196 different directions here. So we have a lot of work to do to achieve a world in which we think that we've really learned from this crisis, and I think there are a lot of lessons that we can take away. So I've tried to be optimistic, positive about how some countries have responded, and maybe indicate a few trends that I think are fairly predictable. But we don't know how we're going to handle these deeper questions, and I really hope that everyone in this generation is going to be part of a positive and progressive answer to those questions. So let me stop right there and open it up for discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Parag. Some really interesting stuff there. Like you say, a water cannon of data. I'm drenched in data. So much interesting stuff. But more positive than I thought it was going to be, honestly. The deploying tech to create new jobs rather than destroying them, which is the traditional narrative around tech, of course. And so many kind of green shoots, a lot of optimism there. But as you mentioned at the top, this isn't a post-pandemic world yet, so we can't really get into that kind of conversation. And one of the first questions I want to ask, which came from the registration process, was from Serge Dive, who is the CEO of Beyond Luxury Media. He's talking about the companies that are suffering or have suffered and shut down already. He asks, has poor governance brought about the downfall of many companies in the post-COVID-19 era?
So poor governance of companies or poor governance of countries? And he may not have a chance to respond, so I'll just kind of make, I'll assume that the question is both. Poor governance of countries, absolutely, because you may not have had enough stimulus, for example, not enough sort of policy reforms that allow for companies to sort of kick debt down the road and this kind of thing. So some of these short-term measures, suspension of corporate debt payments, and so on. So that would be the regulatory side by governments. Then companies, obviously, that have not had enough cash on their balance sheets, not had enough savings, if you will, not quickly found ways to maybe reduce the workload of the labor force, ideally keeping people employed, but spacing out employment so that their CapEx or their OpEx goes down a little bit. These are some of the things that people are talking about in the business community around how you conserve capital in times of significant demand contraction. So it's not too late for most companies yet. It's obviously already too late for some, but this is part of what happens after events like this. Is you have a restructuring, you have M&As, you have assets that can be sold and acquired and consolidated, and for better or worse, that's what we'll see happen again.
Indeed. We have a question from the chat box as well from El Valencia, who asks, how can we be sure that we go back to a more equitable world post-pandemic versus actually increasing inequality? Especially in Asia, Earl says, where there is strong inequality already.
Right. No, it's a great question. So, but I mean, there's a sort of an inherent contradiction that we have to grapple, that we have to kind of embrace in our minds, which is that we can't go back to a more equitable world if we weren't equitable before, because we, as she said, or as he said, we have very high inequality already. Now, I want to make a point here is, in Western societies, particularly in the US and Europe, inequality is a huge topic. It's driving a lot of the politics. And yet inequality in, let's say, the United States, where it's high, it's nothing compared to in Asia, right? One of the data points that I use to explain this is very straightforward. In America, the wealthiest state is Maryland, which is outside Washington, D.C. Its per capita annual median income is $60,000. The poorest state is Mississippi, $30,000. That's a 2-to-1 gap. Now, if Asia, if just ASEAN were a country, let's compare Singapore and Myanmar, right? That's about a 40-to-1 income gap, right? So income inequality, or inequality in general, given the number of billionaires, but also absolute poor people, that contrast and that large population size, that contrast is far more acute in Asia than any other part of the world. And yet in our politics, in our study, we talk about inequality, but it isn't the animating sort of force or the central issue, because we still have a huge amount of poverty. And what I think is constructive in our dialogue here in Asia is that we're still focused on poverty reduction. You can talk about or be incensed by, angered by inequality all you want, but you're never going to change it or improve the condition unless you focus on poverty, unless you raise the floor. Right? Bringing down the ceiling through high taxation doesn't really get you very far when you still have 2 billion poor people. And what I think is important, what you see in Myanmar, what you see in Thailand, what you see in Indonesia, what you see in the Philippines, and what you've already seen in China and what's happening in India is focus on poverty, focus on connectivity, focus on empowerment, focus on inclusion, focus on roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, internet connections, and bandwidth and jobs. And if you do those things, you will eventually actually reduce inequality. And again, in Asia, we have a long way to go in that regard.
Right. I think we really need to recalibrate what we're focusing on. Indeed. We have time for one more question, maybe two. We'll see how we go. I'm going to ask another question that was submitted when the attendees registered, this time from Jonathan Lam. Jonathan is the co-founder of a startup called Butler Asia, based here in Hong Kong. Jonathan asks, what would be the biggest change in consumer behavior post-COVID-19?
It's a great question. So it's a sort of microeconomic one and a household one. And I would say that first, higher degree of precautionary savings. So in general, Asia has tended to have high savings rates. However, we have seen that change because home ownerships go down, there's more disposable income, people have been spending more, conspicuous consumption obviously as well. But across the board, you will obviously see more people tending to save a little bit more to ride out the storm. You know, even in countries with very low unemployment like Singapore, where we will obviously see that tick up for a while. So that's one thing. Another that relates to this, and of course Matt is going to talk about this in his session, but skilling, right? Do I have the right skills for the future market? You know, am I capable of being a remote worker in my profession? Because you never know when the next lockdown is going to be and quarantine, whatever the case may be. So I think people will invest more in the essential goods of like education. People will save more as well. And I'll make a point again about sort of migration, even if it's domestic. And that is that what this experience of the past month has taught us is that, we may not have appreciated our immediate 5-block radius. So I think that's a phrase that's now entrenched in a lot of people's minds, which is like, what 5-block radius do I live in? You know, do I have, am I near a health clinic? Am I near a park? Nature, food, fresh air, whatever the case may be, friends and family as well. So a lot of people may say, you know what, I'm going to pick a different 5-block radius. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a change in behavior as well.
We have in the chat box as well from a Lily Ong, who asks if the pandemic is going to lead to more localization. You mentioned the 5-block radius. Do you think we're going to, basically our economy is going to have to be restructured? We've realized we do need to be more kind of locally self-sustaining.
Yeah, so again, and I think that will really accelerate. It was happening in different parts of the world at different speeds prior to the pandemic, but this will be, sort of relocalization will be a critical thing, obviously. So again, 3D printing medical devices or even other kinds of manufactured goods, or just diversification of supply chains more broadly. So making sure that, if you were getting all of your wheat from one country, try and get it from 3 or 4 different countries. Same thing for pharmaceuticals, obviously, and all manner of goods. So this is something that a country like Singapore, for example, has always been hypersensitive to. But larger countries with big populations can also do more to be more self-sufficient. That is not a bad thing. I just want to point out, I'm someone who champions globalization, but not for its own sake. So if countries move more towards energy self-sufficiency, right, have more renewable energy, more solar power, wind power, and so forth, and therefore you have fewer tankers of oil sailing around the world, statistically that will mean that globalization will decrease. I would celebrate that, obviously. There's no reason for us to have to put black tar on ships and sail it around the world to power our electricity in our houses, right? So let's celebrate that localization. Let's do more. Let's grow more food. Let's have more solar power. Let's decrease globalization and increase our localization. And we'll create a very positive arms race in the sense of societies that have their act together and are providing for the largest number of people locally.
Oh, you seem to have dropped out there, Parag, at least on my screen. Can you hear me? Parag, can you hear me?
Yeah.
The thumbs up. Oh, okay, we have you back there. Sorry, please do continue.
Oh, I'm not sure where I may have cut off, but I was saying that, we should celebrate localization.
Yeah, indeed. One of the many lessons I think we've learned from the pandemic, and one of the lessons and insights we've learned from your talk as well. Thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. It's been a real pleasure. We are out of time now, unfortunately. I need to move on. But it's been fantastic, and I hope it's not too long until we speak to you again.
Likewise. Thanks again. Have a great program.
Bye-bye.